Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest edition of RE257, where I take old stories I've narrated and update them to modern audio standards. This particular story is called Time to Meet the Humans, written by Runner 1. A lifetime ago, he worked as a transcriptionist for the Galactic Conference. He had lived a comfortable existence on the conference home world, his position allowing him the privilege of rising later than most to perform his duties in the comfort and safety of the capital office building. Although not a job that led to fame, riches, or power, he had enjoyed reasonable hours and generous relaxation times. But that had all come crashing down in the blink of an eye. The humans had swept across the conference like wild beasts through the field of younglings. But he had known what the outcome would be, even before they came. From the moment he had viewed the indomitable logs, he knew, somehow, deep down in his gut, he knew that the conference would fall. He decided to get as far away from these humans as possible. Loading up his small family, he had headed for the most remote colony world he could think of. Perhaps he was motivated by fear, or perhaps it was simply the desire to see his son grow up before the humans caught up with him. It was on that small, distant agricultural world that he settled. There, he had become a farmer. There, made a new life. He did get to watch his son grow up, and on that world, he now watched his grandson play. And it was on that same world where he had watched his wife grow old. There, he had laid her to rest, in soil far from the world of her birth. Now, he looked up at that same soil as the sonic booms of the human ships shattered the stillness as they swept across the pinkish sky. The yellow-skinned female pulled the small child tighter and turned towards the ground vehicle. The young yellow-skinned male turned to follow. "Wait," said the elderly being as he reached up and grabbed his son's arm before he got out of reach. "You can't fight them." The young man paused and slowly turned back towards his father. There were tears streaming down his face. "I know, Dad," he said, "but what choice do we have? These humans overthrew the conference in a matter of months. They ran through our soldiers as though they were nothing more than stalks of grain." "That's my point. These humans cannot be stopped. I realized that a very long time ago. Look around you, son. This world is the hindsight of the galaxy. Why do you think I brought you and your mother to a place like this? It wasn't for the scenery." "I know, Father. You ran away to protect us, and I'm okay with that. But there is nowhere left to run. That's my point, son. We can't fight them, and we can't run." "So, what's left?" sobbed the yellow-skinned female as she wrapped her arms around her spouse and pulled the three of them together. "Do we just wait here to die?" The older being slowly lifted himself from the wicker-like chair he had been sitting in. Reaching towards the nearby doorway, he retrieved a walking stick from its resting place in the corner of the doorway. As he stepped forward, it was clear that he was in pain. His joints were stiff from advanced age and lack of proper medical care. Groaning in discomfort, he mused, "Well, that's one price we paid for being this far out." The young alien male reached out and braced his frail father. "Where are you going, Dad?" he asked. "I'm going to town." The yellow-skinned being skillfully guided the ground vehicle towards the center of the town, a few kilometers from his father's farmhouse. To his right sat his mate, tears of fear and uncertainty still dampening her face. Between them, playing with a toy spacecraft, sat their son, securely strapped into his youth safety seat. In the passenger seat, directly behind the operator seat, sat his father. The elderly being sat silently, with his hands crossed over the top of his walking stick. He gazed out the window, watching the buildings slide by as the ground vehicle traveled almost silently over the smoother roads of the small town. The vehicle rounded a corner and a crowd of people appeared, gathered in a small town square. It was clear that word of the humans' arrival had spread quickly, though the repeated sonic booms of the arriving landing craft would have been hard to miss. Slowing the vehicle, the driver continued forward towards the center of the gathered mass of beings. Slowly, the crowd parted and allowed the vehicle to drive nearly to the center of the gathering before stopping. Shutting off the engine, the young man stepped out and opened the rear door, allowing his father to stand from the vehicle. Though there was an overlapping cacophony of voices and sounds, most agonizing in fear over the arrival of the humans, several voices could be heard well above the others, calling for volunteers to fight the humans. As the elderly being stood, many in the crowd recognized him as one of the settlement's oldest and most distinguished citizens, and grew quiet. As the elderly being slowly walked around the vehicle, supporting himself with a walking stick, more and more present recognized him, and they too grew quiet. Continuing forward, we reached the elevated platform in the center of the square and started up the steps. With each feeble step, the crowd grew quieter. At the top was a young town chairman. It was his job to see that the small community on the outskirts of civilization ran smoothly. Long ago, the original chairman assigned here by the Galactic Conference had grown old and passed from this life. Without the stabilizing support of the Galactic Conference, no one knew what to do, and his lieutenant had simply taken over. When he too grew unable to serve, his lieutenant had replaced him, and so the process had continued for decades. By now, a young male, born and raised in this world, a being that had never known conference rule, served as chairman. The young chairman stepped aside as the elderly being reached the top. Across the square, an almost palpable hush covered the gathered mass of beings. The elderly yellow-skinned being paused for a moment before he slowly turned to face the crowd. For long moments, he stood silently while he scanned the faces in the crowds. Among them were the young and old, male and female, businessman and laborer. Beings from all walks of life stood looking up at him. What words do I have for them, he thought. What could a coward possibly say to calm their fear? A coward. The words, although spoken only in his thoughts, reverberated in his mind, as though they were the sound of thunder rolling across the countryside. Am I a coward for protecting my son? He thought, as his eyes were drawn to his son still standing by the open door of the ground vehicle. Suddenly, it was as though a bolt of lightning bit his psyche. Straightening up, he took a breath of air and stood strongly and forcibly, as though he was a much younger man. Citizens, a lifetime ago, everything we knew, everything we believed was stolen from us. Those of us who are alive then can remember. The Galactic Conference was everything. The Conference ruled all. The Conference gave all. And the Conference took all. To us, the Galactic Conference was as solid and timeless as the stars themselves. To many, the Conference was something to put faith in, if not a religion in name. Faith in the Conference was a religion in practice. But we had that faith stripped from us. In the wink of an eye, the Conference is gone, torn asunder by a new force in the galaxy. A race of beings who only a few years before thought that they were the only life in the universe. A race that did not even have FTL travel until they stood it. No, they did not steal it. The Conference gave it to them. The Conference, following its own rules and procedures, handed the humans FTL travel on a platter. And in self-righteous arrogance, the Conference failed to see the repercussions that were sure to follow. Now those same humans that took down the most powerful institution that the galaxy had ever known stand on our doorstep, and I hear calls to fight them. You cannot fight a hurricane. You cannot fight a thunderstorm. They are forces of nature. You learn how to live with forces of nature. You build your house on high ground far from the sea. You place lightning rods in your house to protect it from lightning, and you build your roofs and walls to survive the wind. These humans are a force of nature, and if we are to survive, we must find a way to live with them. For a long moment, the crowd was silent, and then, slowly, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was his son still standing by the open door of his ground vehicle. Slowly, almost cautiously, A second pair of hands joined the first, quickly followed by a third, then a fourth, a fifth. In a matter of seconds, the applause grew into a crescendo of raucous cheers and yells of support that continued for long minutes. Presently, another voice began to rise up above the rest. At first, not understandable above the din, the voice repeated. Still drowned out by the others, it repeated for a third time, then a fourth time. Slowly the roar of the crowd diminished, and a lone voice could be heard. How? How do we live with them? They conquered the galaxy, they destroyed the Confronts, and now you say that we have to live with them. How do you know that they will even let us live at all? Much less with them. The source of the voice was not easily visible, but the effect was. The crowd once again grew silent. Every face turned back towards the elderly being on the platform, as though waiting for an answer. Still standing straight and firm, despite his age, the elderly being raised his hand high over his head. I will meet with the humans. No, you can't, a single voice cried, slamming the vehicle door shut. The young male surged through the crowd and bounded up the steps to his father. Dad, you cannot. You gave up everything to protect me and Mom. You can't throw that all away. Reaching out, the elderly father took his son's hand. Son, I did not give up anything. You and your mother were my everything. Oblivious to the gathered crowd, he pulled his son close and hugged him. I came to this world to protect you, he whispered inside his ear. I came here because I could see what was coming, and I wanted to see you grow up. I wished for you to have a life. And now, the elderly being pushed his son back and held him at arm's length, looking first towards the ground vehicle where his daughter-in-law stood holding his grandson, and then back towards the young man, and returned his voice to normal levels. Looking at you, your lovely wife and son, all my wishes have been fulfilled. But, Father, the elderly being lifted his hand and placed a single finger over his mouth. Shh, he whispered. I now have a new wish. I want my grandson to grow up just as you did. Before you place me in the ground beside your mother, I want to know that he too will continue. Is that not what you wish too? Of course, Father, answered the son, almost in a whisper. Son, long ago I saw what these humans were capable of. I saw it in the recordings of the captain's log. I heard it in the sound of the captain's voice. But I also saw something else. What is that, Father? Here on this world, the humans have always been perceived as an unstoppable evil. Everyone here has lived their entire life knowing the humans only as a force that destroyed their way of life. But I've seen something different. I don't understand, Father. You've known for your whole life that I was the one who transcribed the logs of first contact with the humans. Of course. Everyone here knows the story of how you quit your job the very next day and moved my mother and me as far away as possible. Yes, everyone knows that story. But there was more. I don't understand, Father. Well, it was the logs of what happened to the Indomitable after the humans snuck on board that motivated me to leave the conference homeworld. There was many other logs, both personal and official, included in the blog buoy dump. I learned a lot about these humans through those logs. I don't see how ships and personal logs could teach you anything about the humans. I was able to read about the crew members' interactions with the humans before the attack. There was one thing I know. The humans are capable of logical and reasonable action. But, Father, the elderly being cut him off. No more buts. All of us here saw the human ships arrive. All of us saw that there are 3 large craft, possibly transports, carrying who knows how many troops and weapons. We all saw them land. They could only be a few kilometers to the east of town. And I have no doubt that while we have been standing here, getting time talking and worrying, the humans are preparing too, if not already, heading in this direction. Ending his speaking, the elderly being turned and started down the steps. The crowd parted in silence and allowed him easy access to his son's ground vehicle. Rounding the operator's door, he started to lower himself into the operator position. Before he could lower himself into the seated position, he felt a tug on his arm. Turning, he looked directly into his son's eyes. You're not going alone, the young man said. No, I won't let you come, replied the father. "This will be dangerous," he added, glancing towards his daughter-in-law, who now stood only a few meters away, clutching her child, while tears descended her face. "You and family." "And if you fail, Father, what would it matter? If the humans are here to attack and you fail to reach an agreement with them, we're all dead anyway." "If I do fail, you would at least have a little more time with them." The younger being looked towards his family again, then turned back to his father. "You're not going to fail, Father." The ground vehicle glided to a stop just ahead, partially shrouded in clouds of dust. The human convoy lumbered toward them. It was impossible to see how many vehicles were approaching, as they traveled mostly single file. However, it was clear that there were many vehicles present, all of them large transports. If the vehicles were carrying troops and weapons, the fears of the townspeople were absolutely justified. It would be a slaughter. Opening the passenger door, the elderly yellow-skinned being stood and, using his walking stick for support, moved around the vehicle to the middle of the road. A pair of humans could be seen in the open-topped lead vehicle. One was the operator, and due to all the shiny metal decorations and rank insignia, the other was clearly in charge. As his eyes fell upon the elderly yellow-skinned being standing in the middle of the roadway, he raised an arm in the air and clenched his fist. In the vehicle behind him, another human raised his arm and duplicated the gesture. This action continued throughout the convoy, and soon the entire group rolled to a halt. The human in the lead vehicle spoke a command to the vehicle operator and, opening a door, climbed down from the elevated passenger area. Reaching the roadway, the human turned and surveyed the mass of stopped vehicles. A few moments passed while he seemed to size up the situation. Presently, human turned the other way and walked in the direction of the elderly yellow-skinned alien. The near silence in which he moved was quite disconcerting. The only sound to be heard was the crunch of the gravel under the human's oversized boot. The human continued forward until he stood just an arm's reach from the elderly yellow-skinned being. There he stopped, and to be continued tomorrow. End of story. I would like to thank our T5 members and patrons, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, Vidmori, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.